Hi, how are you? My name is Casiana Warfield. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about something that I feel like is very close to my heart and very necessary, and that is discrimination survival skills. Who I am is a pre-doctoral intern at Purdue University Counseling and Psychological Services. I'm getting my PhD in clinical psychology, and I used to teach a course on prejudice and discrimination at another university. And so I'm really excited to speak on what I can hopefully provide to be helpful to you all today. It will be tailored to the current crisis situation that we're in. So the historical moment that we're in right now for future reference is we're sort of in the midst of a global pandemic due to COVID-19. And I am creating this sort of in response to my own and other people's experience with the uptick in xenophobia and discrimination towards Asian and Asian American individuals in the US and around the globe. So I am hopeful that I can just create a space for us to talk about it and be frank about it, but also to give you some survival skills. And I will be talking about those further as we go forward. So hopefully this will take about 30 minutes or so, and that this can be something you can go back to. All of the resources that I list in the presentation, I will give you access to in some way through a Word document, okay? So, what I'll be talking about today, I'll be reviewing stigma and as it relates to discrimination and who is discriminated against. We'll be talking about the current historical moment in terms of the pandemic and how that's affected discrimination. We'll talk about how discrimination impacts the victim, but hopefully to spend the majority of the time identifying some skills, namely distress tolerance skills that will help us to get through the moment of when we are a victim or witnessing someone else be a victim or just affected by the xenophobia that's happening right now. I hope that these skills can be helpful beyond this moment for anyone who's experiencing discrimination. This is something that I use in my own treatment to help people to deal with things like trauma, to deal with just really intense emotions, and to still make the most of the life that we have to live. And then finally, I'll review briefly some resources for reporting. And again, those will be listed on the Word document that I will send out. So who experiences discrimination? I think that this is something that's really important to understand just so that we can validate that this is an experience that many minority individuals have in the US. Discrimination and prejudice is still very alive and real. It has become something over time that's become a little bit more covert or subtle, but the impact is not subtle. The impact is not small. With the current crisis, the discrimination has become more overt or blatant, and I'll talk about that in the next few slides. So when we think about discrimination, I think it could be really helpful to understand it psychologically, so that we can excuse the behavior or make it right, but so that we can understand what might motivate someone to do this, and that might help us to understand our own response to it, hopefully. So there's many theories of prejudice and discrimination. One that I'll talk about today is the idea that discrimination is something someone does in defense of themselves. So if they're dealing with some sort of feeling that is uncomfortable or an experience that is painful, or if they just don't really feel great about themselves, they want to protect themselves, they might engage in discrimination. It's typically aligned to maybe a bully or something like that. Like maybe they're being bullied in some other way, or they have a lot of emotions they don't know how to deal with, and so they respond in this really unhelpful and harmful way. Who gets discriminated against is actually defined by the groups that are in power in our society. And so we call these groups the majority group or the dominant group, and they have a level of privilege that means that they don't experience discrimination. Or if they do experience unfair treatment, it doesn't impact them in the same ways as those groups without privilege. And those groups are stigmatized groups, namely groups that do not share that privileged status with the majority group. And because of that, they suffer a lot more consequences of unfair treatment. Those individuals in this group tend to have a characteristic, or more likely a set of characteristics, that are devalued in some way. So I think about this in terms of like fat culture. So many people have devalued individuals who carry body fat on their body, especially in certain areas. And we've seen how that has evolved over time. But generally, because having fat is not valued and is seen as unattractive, those individuals who carry fat on their body in those ways are also devalued. And that characteristic distinguishes that person from the majority. It's a very visual thing. It's something that you can see. And so we think about things like race. It's very visual, and you can distinguish that person from the majority group based off of those visual characteristics. And then that group and those individuals are considered to be deviant for that reason, because they're different, and there's often a lot of shame that's ascribed to them. Frequently, those individuals are objectified, and this is important to understand, because if you objectify someone, or you treat them or see them as an object or as indistinguishable from other people in that group, right, you can dehumanize them. If you can take the human individual quality away from somebody, it is much easier to hurt them and mistreat them, right? If you see someone as no different from like an office chair, you don't necessarily have as many of the barriers to treating them in an unfair way as you would if you saw them as a person with emotions and feelings and unique qualities. And so I see this a lot in the Asian and Asian American populations when we just even talk about them in that way, right? Even just referring to this very diverse group of different ethnicities, different nationalities, different cultures as Asian. We can really dehumanize them, and we don't see them as individuals. And thus, discrimination and prejudice is sort of sanctioned towards this group in our society. And I'm not saying it's not sanctioned for other groups, but this is one of the reasons why it is still sort of a part of many people's comedy routines to scapegoat or take or laugh at Asian or Asian American individuals. It's still very much a part of our pop culture, and it certainly is a part of our interactions now in the light of COVID-19. And I just wanted to highlight this quote by the Dalai Lama. All suffering is caused by ignorance. People inflict pain on others in the selfish pursuit of their own happiness or satisfaction. And I think that rings true, at least for how I can understand this phenomenon. Another thing that's important to understand is there are many stigmatized groups, but some groups have more harmful stigma than others. And if you have a harmful stigma, there are really direct negative consequences that are just worse than if you have a more benign stigma. And it's not to say that, stigma is ever okay, but it's good to recognize that it's on a spectrum. And so the things that predict that are coarse, concealability, aesthetic qualities, origin, and danger. So firstly, whether that identity is a long-lasting chronic one or a temporary one, a stable one versus an unstable. So if it's more chronic and long-lasting or stable, that's going to have longer-term, more consistent negative consequences for that person. If it's a more temporary situation, or if it's sort of unstable in some ways, then there are definitely negative consequences, but they're not as consistent and therefore not as long-term harmful for that person's health. So I think about this in terms of things like identities that are lifelong, like gender or sex, right? Those typically can be lifelong, although if we can recognize the trans community as well, there are exceptions to that. And when we think about something such as perhaps wealth, sometimes that is something that can change over time, for the better or for the worse. And so we would see more negative consequences for something that's more stable in terms of identity. Concealability. So how easily can you hide or control that visibility of that identity if you're a stigmatized person? Race is one that is often very difficult to conceal. However, if you think about multiracial individuals such as myself, sometimes that can vary depending on the space that you're in. It depends wholly on that other person's perceptions. When we look at things like across different minority groups, so if you look at Black individuals or African American individuals, there tends to be something like the one drop rule, where very much if you are any percentage of that race, it is something that is a part of a stigmatized identity. It is very salient in our culture due to our history of slavery, and just the way that we have sort of we have oppressed Black and African American individuals. So that's something to think about. Something that's more concealable might be something like sexual orientation. Now that has negative consequences as well, but if you can conceal it, then you can control like where you are stigmatized in some spaces, in some cases. So that's just for the sake of example. Obviously, there are a lot of within group differences here. Aesthetic qualities. So generally, if you are perceived to be more attractive by the dominant group, you will have less negative consequences of stigma. And again, that is defined by that dominant group. So what is attractive is actually something that is very subjective. It's not something that we measure objectively. It is culturally dependent. Origin. So how did you come to be that part of that group, right? So if it feels like it's something that's under your control, there is less sympathy for you and a lot more anger. So I think of, and that's why I have this picture here, I think of substance use. And sometimes people do have substance abuse issues, and ultimately we don't regard those people very well. We discriminate against those people. We talk about denying those people things like healthcare because we view that the origin of their stigma was within their control. And while it might be true that it was that person's decision to use that substance the first time, addiction is a very powerful thing. And while some people can use things once and they don't become addicted, many people can use things a few times and they become very powerfully addicted physiologically. And to stop doing that is something that's very hard to do without professional help. And so we don't have a lot of pity for those individuals, unfortunately, but that is what makes it a harmful stigma. And finally, danger. So how dangerous that person is perceived to be, especially to the majority group, that will determine how much stigma is happening as well, and how harmful it is. And so when we think of the shootings that have been happening for a long time but are now recognized by larger society, or at least the media, the shootings of Black males, that is arguably due to them having a stereotype of being dangerous to others and being more prone to violence. And so you see these things where unarmed Black men and boys are being killed by police officers because they are assumed to be dangerous in the moment. And even though the facts of the situation were like that person or persons, so they didn't have a weapon on them, they are being brutally killed out there, and it's sanctioned by our society. So that is a very harmful stigma. You can see right there, death is a very probably the worst consequence that there could be for a stigma. And so the idea with this is to give you a sense of, how does society perceive us, and how might this translate into discrimination? Now, the current situation that we are in, I think, is really important to acknowledge too. So COVID-19 has led to an increase in uncertainty. We don't know when it's going to end. We don't know how it's going to affect our society fully. We don't know if there's going to be a vaccine soon enough to sort of really allow this to not have as many far-reaching economic, personal, relational, racial consequences or not. There's a lot of fear of being exposed and to losing people. There is just discomfort with having to social distance and having to change, all related to this pandemic. And if we refer back to our theory of discrimination, that people act out in defense and to avoid these feelings of discomfort and pain, we can see how this would contribute to really ramping up the amount of xenophobia and discrimination that's happening. The reason why it is going towards those individuals, at least from what we can tell, is due to a number of reasons. Because of their salience as the other, as being very visually, culturally, relationally different from the majority, and because of the way that our world leaders have talked about and spread misinformation about this pandemic, COVID-19 has been regarded as an Asian originated virus, even though Asian individuals are not more likely to contract or be infected with this virus than anyone else, than white individuals, than black individuals, than Hispanic and Latino individuals, Latinx individuals. They are linked very visually to the virus in the way we talk about it. And we think about just how our president calls it the Chinese virus, right? Like that really associates that group with it. And because we regard Asians as homogenous, despite all the cultural variability, the impact is on all Asian communities. So there has been a documented increase in discrimination against this population in the US, but also around the world. We also have to think about, okay, how are hate crimes motivated in general? Well, one is to protect your in-group, to protect your people and your territory and your resources, to also coerce that feared group to leave or to subjugate themselves. It could be retaliation for being for some kind of offense. And if we're making Asians the enemy here, you might feel, as a majority member, justified in acting violently towards those people. Also, if there has just been a trend of lack of respect for this population or any marginalized population, that can contribute to you dehumanizing them and being willing to do these things. And then again, if we go back to that uncertainty and not being able to do anything really actively except for to social distance about this issue, you might need to feel like you have some agency, might have some control over the situation. And that, for you, if you're a disturbed individual, or even if you're not, you might feel really empowered to do something about it, and that might be acting out against a group that you might not like as much. Hate crimes originate this way in a number of different ways, but they are maintained and continue to happen by us normalizing it in our culture, by us coming to expect it, and also by us not identifying that these things are happening. And if we don't identify them and then we don't condemn them or have any consequences for those people that commit these crimes, it's going to keep happening. And that's really unfortunate. The impact of discrimination is vast, which makes it very unfortunate that these things are continuing. So I've had these mirrored here, these two different responses, one to a hate crime and one to a general trauma response, because I truly feel that if you were to being discriminated against, you are likely to experience trauma, and you're likely to act as though you have experienced a trauma, which is really, really damaging and problematic. So if you look at the common symptoms of a victim of a hate crime, one are these sort of internal events like feeling anxiety, depression, and stress increase, having these very intrusive thoughts, often worry thoughts, fear thoughts. But it can also impact how you work. So difficulty concentrating and focusing on what's in front of you. You might really feel dysregulated, feeling anger, and needing to retaliate in some way, which is going to be problematic for you too. You could feel very exhausted and not really understand why if you're not aware that you're having a trauma response. But also it can affect how you relate to other people. So if you are really fearful, like, when is this going to happen to me again? You might feel very distrustful of other people and like you can't trust that people are going to keep you safe or not hurt you. You might fear that like you are just personally more vulnerable to these things. And ultimately you just have difficulty coping with being a victim. And when some things are not going right with ourselves, it impacts our relationships with other people. And so if things aren't going right with you, you might have difficulties in relating to other people in your life, even if those people are trying to help you. Similar to a trauma that we might see in, say, a veteran or a victim of sexual assault. Like, these things look very similar and you can see them mirrored here. Further, you don't actually have to experience the event directly to experience the symptoms as if you had experienced it directly. So you can still have a trauma response if you are just witnessing the event happen to someone you love or someone who looks like you, or seeing those things in the news. And so that's where we have to be careful. We want to stay informed, but at the same time, we don't want to experience this response. And you might similarly have a fear like, well, if that person that's like me, is being attacked? When will I be attacked? And sometimes that just ambiguity and uncertainty can be really uncomfortable and painful as well. And you might feel like, I really need to hide right now. I need to hide who I am. And that can come in the form of disengagement, disidentification, or compensating behaviorally. So you might disengage from what has happened so that you don't have to take those hits to your well-being. You might disidentify with how important things like cultural identity might be to you or your community so that you don't become a victim as well. And you might compensate to really not fit into those stereotypes. So I know, for example, for me, I want to wear a mask in public. I really want to wear a mask in public to protect myself and my family. But I know as an Asian person, when I put a mask on, because wearing masks as a civilian in this country is just not as seen as okay and is not as common, I feel very stigmatized and identified. And I feel like my Asian identity is putting a target on my back. It's just how I feel, whether it's true or not, that's my feeling. And in that way, it can be seen as sort of a secondary trauma response. So what do we do? One is to participate in things like this and just become aware of how you might be being impacted and make room and compassion for that, for yourself and others. The other way is these very specific skills for dealing with the emotional consequences of this event and trying to make the most out of the life that we are being given and try to prevent as many of the long-term consequences of these traumas as possible. And so I often use the stress tolerance skills in my own treatment with individuals to help them to feel safe and to help them get to a place where that they can do things that are more productive and effective and not engage in like self-harm, not engage in relational conflict if they don't have to, and help them to just improve how they're feeling in the moment. These are things for a crisis. And so if we regard discrimination as a crisis, we can see how these fit. These are not for everyday problems and stresses, right? Like, those aren't going to be effective, but these are for those really acute, intense events that have very serious in the moment consequences, right? So I'm trying to create for you a little toolkit so that you can feel like you have some things to go to in the moment. Distress tolerance skills are skills for tolerating painful events, urges, and emotions, especially when you cannot make those things better right away. So for instance, it could be that you're experiencing sort of intense emotional or physical pain that really needs to be helped quickly, but it's hard to do when we're feeling like that. It could be when you're feeling that intense emotion to do something, but acting on those emotions and giving into those urges would actually make the situation worse, or it might be actually unsafe for you to do in the moment. It also is useful for when we're feeling overwhelmed, but at the same time life goes on and we have to get things done. So I'm thinking about, we're still doing remote learning. We still have to do all these classes. We still have to do our jobs. Unfortunately, many of us do not get to distance in that way. But you have to get things done. And if that's important to you, then these can be helpful for getting through in the moment. These also are helpful when we can't solve that problem immediately. Maybe you've taken action, you've reported a hate crime, but you don't know when that's going to be resolved. And in the moment you need to deal. This can be helpful to get you to the next step until something can be done. So here's the list of the skills, starting with stop and ending with radical acceptance, that we'll talk through quickly today. Again, I will be sending a link that will have detailed instructions for all of these in case you want to reference. So try to just take these in the moment and then go back to them when you start to practice it with the instructions later. So the first one is our stop skill. So our stop skill is really helpful when you know that you are tempted to react impulsively. Or perhaps you're just making decisions because of all the emotions and thoughts that are going in your head, but you have to respond right then and there. So it's a very quick skill where first you stop, and I would say physically and mentally freeze. Take a step back in your mind, but also physically if it's necessary, and observe what is going on in your environment and what is going on in your mind, and how those things may or may not match up. we can often build things up a little bit more in our head because our mind is trying to solve a problem. But if we can just observe what is actually happening, it can be helpful. And then the last step is the most important, which is to proceed mindfully. So you might ask yourself, what can I do in this moment that will serve me and what I want and what I need? You might ask yourself, what are my goals? What are my values? What do I want to be able to say I did in response to this event tomorrow, in a week, in a year from now? What will I feel satisfied by and not feel regret about? And you can see how if you're feeling really intense emotions, there's no way that you can necessarily make that decision very well because it's going to be very over-influenced by the crisis and potentially some urges that aren't helpful. So again, I want to highlight this quote. Respond, don't react. Listen, don't talk. Think, don't assume. There are very important things that you might miss if you don't stop. One that I think is a skill that many of us are sort of trained in as students from very young are pros and cons lists. And this is very similar, and so hopefully that makes it feel accessible, right? The idea is that if we can be aware of what the consequences of different things that we feel the urge to do, we can make the right choice in the moment. So this is really useful when you have to decide between two different courses of action, or you're trying to decide whether you engage in or not engage in some sort of destructive urge or behavior. So for instance, I will often work with clients who feel like self-harming in the moment in order to deal with it. It works, unfortunately, it's very effective, but it is harmful and not kind to ourselves. And ultimately, long-term wise, not going to be the best solution. So if you're trying to decide between something that might be destructive and something that might not be, or to just literally not engage in it, pros and cons can be helpful in the moment. So first you want to describe whatever that destructive urge or behavior is. And those are typically behaviors that might feel really great in the moment, short term, and have benefits then, but long term is pretty damaging. Then you want to make a pros and cons list about acting on your urges in the crisis, and then make another list of pros and cons about resisting the urges, and then ultimately contrast them. And it can be helpful if you can visually see them together. And then hopefully you can see how long term there's going to be more negative consequences of self-destruction, and it's not going to serve you, and you're going to have regrets about that later on. I really love these next set of skills because they can be really helpful if you just don't have the mental energy or flexibility to think through these other strategies in the moment. They're very quick physical things that you can do. So if you're feeling a lot of agitation and you feel like you need to do something, the Tritip Skills. So really, it's when you need to reduce some sort of extreme emotion, sensation quickly, and you're not able to distract necessarily in the moment. So tip the temperature. This means get yourself cold, right? So I think something that's very accessible is to splash cold water in your face. It might look for you more like an ice pack. It might look for you like going out in the cold if you're in that sort of climate. It might be taking a cold shower. It might be submerging your face for a few seconds in a bowl of cold water, right? These things can really tip your physiological chemistry and help you to get back to a place of calm. Intense exercise, so any sort of 20 to 30 minute exercise that you could do that is very physically intensive, right? So you're not necessarily just taking a stroll down the street. You're walking fast, you're power walking, you're running, you're doing burpees, you're playing some sort of sport or activity that's very fast paced, right? It's not golf, it's basketball. You're lifting weights. But you're doing this for a short period of time, and again, you'll get the benefits of exercise, but you'll also tip your chemistry again so that you can feel more balanced. The next two are great for relaxation. So paced breathing, that can allow you to access your executive functioning or decision-making lobe of your brain, which is your frontal lobe. It can sort of decrease your fight or flight survival response that's happening in your brain and allow you to sort of slow everything down so that you can make better decisions. So I have square breathing described there, which is breathing in for 4, holding for 4, breathing out for 4, and pausing for 4. So square. I also would suggest paired muscle relaxation, which is we're breathing slowly and then we're alternatingly tensing and relaxing our different muscle groups. I have linked here different lengths of exercises. It's definitely one where you potentially need to practice it more before you can do it covertly in public. Alternatively, if you feel comfortable putting in earbuds and having someone walk you through the audio of it, that's helpful too. There's also some benefits to recording that script yourself of, as you move through the muscle groups and then just listening to that later on. Sometimes people find that comforting. And again, this will be all listed in the resource list. I like many of these things because they are just great tools at your fingertips for when you just don't really have all the mental know-how to do the other things that I'm suggesting. The next is accepts. So this is for distraction. We often think of distraction as a negative thing. I do not. I think when you are in a crisis, it is okay to take yourself away from that moment. Netflix it up if you need to, listen to your favorite music if you need to, like do what you need to do to get through that moment. And it's really important that when you do these things, you try to do them mindfully, meaning really attending to that one thing in the moment. So accepts is just a prompt for coming up with this list of distracting activities. You want to create a list that's tailored to you. So develop this list before you're in a crisis, right? First is activities, right? So you want to do those activities that make you feel opposite to the emotions and the thoughts that you have when you're feeling destructive or in a crisis, right? That might be a relaxation. That might be a bubble bath. I don't know. It might be playing sports. I'm not sure. It might be dancing. It might be singing. It might be creating art. C, contributing and comparisons. So comparisons is a simple one you can do in your brain. It's the idea that you might compare yourself to someone who has it worse than you, or in order to sort of have some more perspective, right? So often I'm thinking about, well, I'm a healthcare worker, but I'm not a nurse that's working in the ER that has to be exposed to COVID right now. I kind of got it pretty great. Even though there are things that are definitely challenging about my situation, it can be helpful to just recognize how lucky I am. Contributing. This is a really powerful one. So a lot of people are making masks for healthcare workers right now, and that can be something that you can do to give you an activity and deal with your discomfort, but it's not putting you in danger and it's helping someone else. So if you need to distract from your pain and you can help someone else, I guarantee that's not something that you're going to regret in a year from now. Emotions. So engaging in things that are going to create emotions opposite from what you're currently experiencing. So let's say you're feeling really numb, like you're just sort of hopeless about everything that's happening. It might be important to watch like a real tearjerker, P.S. I love you, things like that are just going to generate really intense emotions for you and help you to feel differently. Alternatively, it could be putting on a comedy special. It could be watching TikTok. It could be watching YouTube. Whatever you need to do to get you to feel differently in the moment. It's okay to distract and create those feelings for yourself. Pushing away. That could be leaving the situation physically and just separating yourself from harmful individuals and situations. Could be that you can't do that. I know that there are many people that are in difficult home environments right now that they normally would be at college for and be avoiding, and they can't leave. They don't have anywhere else to go. And so it might be important for you to mentally build yourself a little fortress. And it sounds silly, but it can be really, really powerful. So it could be building a wall around yourself visually in your mind. It could be creating some sort of shield. It could be imagining some sort of person, fictional or otherwise, who feels really helpful to you to have there, like sort of on your shoulder or near you as a protection. And then thoughts and sensations, again, it's engaging in thoughts and thought patterns that are going to be very diverting and distracting. So sometimes people will sing their favorite song in their head. Sometimes it's reciting something loud that takes a lot of mental energy and distracts you from what you're doing. It could be creating sensations that are very different. than what you're currently experiencing. So you might go back to tip skills with that. So the next piece is more of a sensory one. So this can be really about how do I make myself physically feel different in this moment? I often think of self-soothing as being kind to yourself, comforting, nurturing, peacemaking, gentle, and just how compassionate it can be to take time to take care of yourself in the moment. When we want to self-soothe, we need to do it through as many senses as we can. And so I would, if I were you, consider making a self-soothe kit where you list things that appeal to each of these senses that feel just comforting to you. So it could be for taste that you have a certain meal that your caregivers made you when you're younger that just feels comforting. So I'm thinking for me, it is sinigang, which is a Filipino dish that is warm and comforting, a little bit sour, and just very appealing to my sense of taste, but also my touch in terms of the warmth and smell. You might have a certain site, right? Like certain pictures of you and your friends. Pinterest board collages. It could be that you like to color. It could be that there are certain nature scenes that feel comforting. With sound, I often think of like instrumental or electronic music feeling just very comforting in the moment. Sometimes the words are too much. It could be a playlist though of music from when you were a teenager. That tends to be very diverting for sure. It could be something as simple as white noise for you in the moment. So think through what each of those would be and list them again, creating this kit before you're in the crisis so you have access to it later. Second to last skill that I'll talk about, improve the moment. So often discrimination is a very unpleasant but also seemingly meaningless and just painful experience, and I think it could be helpful to turn that painful moment into one that is positive and has purpose. So it might be about going to a happy place and engaging in imagery that is pleasant and takes us somewhere else. I think one that's really important is meaning. So people often need to create meaning from a meaningless experience to survive, to feel like they have the motivation to go on. So when I think of this, I think of Holocaust survivors who have talked about how if they can find a meaning or a purpose to what they have suffered through, it helps them to hold on. It helped them to get through their time in like concentration camps and being subjugated. Which is not to say that you need to believe that you deserved what has happened to you, but more so that if you can find some sort of impact that is positive for you. So often people will say, everything happens for a reason, including my pain. It taught me something about myself. It taught me something about my environment. It helped me to deal with similar situations in the future. Because I went through this, I can relate to and connect to other people who have went through this. I can help other people. Those are just common reasons that I've heard. So you might consider that. Sometimes people find this meaning through prayer if they feel like they are religious or spiritual. Sometimes that could just be letters to yourself. It doesn't have to be a religious or spiritual thing. Often if we can relax, similar to the imagery, that can make the moment more pleasant. One thing in the moment, that's a really hard one, I think, for a lot of people. We often are multitasking, but if you can just be kind to yourself and allow yourself to just take one thing at a time, to engage in one activity very mindfully, very presently, that can be helpful too. A vacation can be great. So I'm not meaning like, let's go get on a plane, because certainly please don't do that. But taking a brief mental vacation. And for many of us, especially if you are a very driven and independent person, that means accepting help and not doing everything yourself. It means relying upon other people you trust. And that can be hard. It means not being productive that day, even if you have a deadline and you're feeling pressure from your professor to do so. It means taking that time for yourself if you need it, but you have to recognize that you need it to do that. And finally, E, encourage yourself that things are going to be okay, that you can manage this, but also that you might just need to rethink the situation and think about it in a different light. The final skill that I want to address today is a tough one, and I want to be really sensitive and careful about it, because in no way am I trying to suggest that you need to accept the treatment that is unfair when it comes to prejudice and discrimination. What I mean by radical acceptance is this willingness to experience your life and your reality and who you are as you are and as it is. Radical acceptance is not condoning the evil that has happened to you. It's not condoning discrimination. It is not related to what is right or wrong or fair. Whether you accept something is not dependent on whether that thing is fair or not. But it is working that system. It is being effective despite this outdated, oppressive, unjust environment. It's being effective in that environment and making it work for you. And to do that, you have to accept reality as it is. Not the way that we've built it up in our mind, not the way we're interpreting it, not the fears that we're having about it, but what is observable, what is actually happening, what are those limitations that you have and that your society has. It's also accepting that hopelessness and fear you feel about the future, while justified and understandable and reasonable, is not fact. We don't know. We don't have a crystal ball. And our life is worth our life is worth living, even though we know there is going to be pain, which is a tough one. But if we don't even have that basic assumption that we should go on, that we can go on, that there will be something positive at the end of this or through it, why even engage in any of these strategies? Why try to change society? So we need to be able to take stock of that. So again, if we accept that pain is this inevitable, unavoidable experience, and denying that reality actually does not change it, it causes us to suffer more. It turns our pain into suffering. Then we can accept that in order to change, we need to accept the facts. So, for instance, when we're doing, let's say, a math problem, we have to define what that problem is, what kind of problem it is, what it would take to solve the problem before we can actually solve it. If we don't have the facts, if we can't take stock of that in an objective way, there's nothing that we can do. So the idea with radical acceptance and discrimination is if we can acknowledge what the problem is and what has happened and what we need to do and want to do in that situation, then we can begin to change. Then we can begin to feel better and have benefits of it. Something I want to make sure I'm saying is that this engagement in radical acceptance is not surrender, but it is freedom. You are not responsible for your oppression. It's not something you asked for. It is not your fault that you or your community has experienced prejudice or discrimination. Unfortunately, it's also true that we can't control who oppresses us or how. And we can only control how we respond to it. And an unfortunate, unjust truth that we have to accept is that while you did not create these problems that you are experiencing in any way, you are the one that's here watching this presentation. You have to be the one to solve them. And while I will definitely promote allyship wherever I can, we also can't control how effective they're going to be either. But you can control how you respond to these events that are happening to you. So you can engage in distrust tolerance activities, and you can enact institutional change if you can accept where the problems are, if you can know the facts. So another thing that you can do is to bring about awareness by reporting if these things happen to you or a loved one. So I've listed a number of resources here. I want to highlight the Victim Connect Resource Center, which has a number of hotlines. It has a chat function if you don't want to speak to someone on the phone to help you walk through how you would report. I want to highlight also that these are reasons in the red box of why you would call 911 and engage in emergency services when it's a more imminent, life-threatening situation. Stop Appy Hate is an organization of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council that is not only documenting these events but trying to help promote legislation that will protect Asian American Pacific Islander population. There are many states that are experiencing a high level of hate crimes that have created explicit hotlines to call just for that purpose so that you can get help. So you might check that out in your local, in your location. I've just highlighted New York's as they are experiencing a lot of stress due to COVID-19. So here's my references. I will send out the resources to you. Hopefully this feels helpful. I welcome any feedback about this presentation that you might offer. I appreciate your attention. Feel free to contact me at CAPS if you have further questions. And please take care of yourself. Be kind to yourself. We are thinking of you and we are here for you. Thank you.